lot.
Right. That's really beautiful. Yes. I feel the same way.
Amazing.
Yeah. He liked you a lot, Jaime. I'll tell you that much.
I had such admiration for him. I learned from his midot. Every time I saw him, I learned something about his midot that inspired me.
Beautiful. That's beautiful.
He was so committed, so dedicated, and just you don't meet a lot of people in life like that.
Right. But our job today is to train the next generation to emulate, to be people like him. That's obviously
So true.
Our job.
So true. Amen.
Okay. The Gemara, we just got to top of Yud Dalet Amud Aleph, just to bring everybody up to date. The Gemara said that something, if somebody cut the grain and it's in its stalk, and he cut it for the purpose of Succah. That was his intention, to cut the grain. So the Gemara said that Rabbi Menashe said that since you're not interested that the grain part should be connected with the stalk, with the straw, because the grain part, is not kosher for Succah. So therefore he says they're not considered a handle. When you don't want the item to be connected, so that it's not in your benefit, it's not beneficial for you to be connected because you cut it for the purpose of Succah. So then we don't look at it that it's a handle, and therefore the straw part that's connected with the grain part will not be mekabel tumah, will not be susceptible to contamination. Because as we said, if they would be separated, if the food and the straw would be independent, not connected to each other, the food would receive contamination, the straw won't receive contamination. The issue is when you have something, if the straw would be if it would be connected to the grain for the purpose of food purposes, if you want to eat it, then you want it to be connected. It's beneficial for you that it's connected. It's connected because you can move it around easily because it's connected to the stalk. Here the Gemara says, but when you're not interested in its connection, so we don't look at them as one entity. When you want them to be connected, it's like a handle on a pot. You want the handle to be connected to the pot. So then if the handle becomes contaminated, if the item that contaminates the handle, it goes to the whole pot. Or if the pot becomes contaminated, the handle becomes contaminated. They're like one entity. But when you want it to be separate, when you want the two items to be separate, but then it's not considered one entity. And therefore, the straw part is not mekabel tumah, and therefore will be kosher for Succah. If it's one entity, then it is susceptible to contamination, because if it's a handle with the food, so then it would be, if it's a handle, then it has the law of the food, which is susceptible to contamination. The Gemara challenged his position, Menashe's position, because the Gemara had a Breita. And the Breita brought two opinions, and one opinion in the Breita seemed to indicate that it would have a status of a handle. That there is a handle, even though you're using it for Succah. Because that was the Gemara's question. If you're using it for Succah, why should it have a status of a handle? According to the rabbi, Rabbi Menashe says if you're using it for Succah, you don't want it to be connected. It should not have a status of a handle. So then the Gemara says, you know what? The reason why there is one early rabbi that said it's considered a handle is because you originally cut it for the purpose of food. You wanted to eat this grain. You didn't want to cut it for Succah purposes. Then you changed your mind, and now you want to use it for what? For Succah. So that's why. So since you had intention originally to use it for food, and as a food, the stalk connected to the grain is healthy. It's good for you to have it connected. It makes it easy for you to transport. You want it to be there together. So therefore it's a handle, and therefore it's a handle. So therefore it doesn't lose the status even when you change your mind and you want to use it for schach, and you're not interested anymore for it to be connected. At the end of the day, it got its status of a handle, and by having a mind that you don't want it to be a handle, it's not enough to remove the status of the handle. But the Gemara says, and the other rabbi, what does the other rabbi hold? Because in the Breita, there were two opinions in the Breita whether this grain has a status, is still considered a handle. The other opinion, the Breita holds, the fact that you change your mind is enough to lose the status of a handle. So that's where the Gemara was holding. The Gemara was saying that Menashe, who says when you cut it originally for schach, it's not a handle, that's because it was originally for schach purposes. If it's cut for schach purposes, it's not a handle. But when you did not originally cut it for schach purposes, you originally cut it for what? For food purposes. It got the status of a handle. It doesn't leave the status of a handle unless something, just by having a change of mind. So that's where there's the early dispute. Meaning Rav Menashe comes to the table. If you have Menashe at the podium, Rav Menashe will say, I, Rav Menashe, when I say when you cut grain, it's not a, for the schach, it's not a handle, that's if you originally cut it for the purpose of schach. But if you originally cut it for food, and then you change, which got a status of a handle, and then you change your mind, and now you say that no longer I want to use it for food, I want to use it for schach, that's where there's an early dispute of the rabbis, whether change of mind is good enough. Okay, so we're going to see. So very good. So look at this. Based on this fact, the next point of the Gemara, we'll answer your question, Mr. Patesh. So the Gemara challenges such a suggestion because the Gemara says, how could there be a rabbi that says that once it came to a status of contamination, that it was once it's a handle, because you had in mind you wanted it to be a handle, because you cut it for the purpose of food, where do we ever find that anybody would say that it's removed from the handle by just mere thought? Mere thought should not be enough to remove it from a status of a handle. Where's it based on? That's where the top of the page. Kol ha'kelim yordim on Yud Dalet Amud Aleph, 14a. Kol ha'kelim yordim l'dei tumah b'machshava. All utensils become contaminated through your thought. What does it mean through your thought? In order for a utensil to be susceptible to receive contamination from something that has the ability to contaminate, the utensil has to be a finished product. If you're in the middle of manufacturing the utensil and it's not complete, it will not be susceptible to contamination. Okay? If it's not complete, once you had in mind that this is the completion of the product, it has its use. Like they give an example, let's say a tabletop. If let's say you were making leather for a tabletop, and it'll serve as a cover for a table. So now that's one, some people stop the process right over there. Sometimes people take the leather to a next level to make shoes out of it, sandals out of it. So therefore, depending on your mindset is at which stage would it be susceptible to contamination. So if you have in mind once it's already ready for a tabletop, you had in mind you wanted it for a tabletop. At that moment, it now has the ability to receive contamination from something that has the ability to contaminate. If you had in mind that you weren't finished yet with your work, you're still in the middle of the manufacturing process, but you want to make it into shoes. So even though it technically has the ability to be used as a tabletop, but it's still not finished yet. The product is not finished. Your mindset was not that it should be finished at the tabletop, and therefore it's still not able to receive contamination. But an unfinished product is not able to receive contamination. That's what it means. Kol kelim, all utensils, yordim l'dei tumah b'machshava. It goes down to, it has the ability to accept contamination through your mindset. You had a mindset. You felt that it was complete. You felt that your manufacturing was complete. Now, the ain olim mitumatam ela b'shiri maseh. But let's say now that it became contaminated, now that let's say it became a tabletop. Let's say you had in mind you want to be a leather tabletop, and you finished making a tabletop. Now you want to say, no, I don't want to use it for a tabletop anymore. I want to go to the next stage of the processing. I want to go ahead and I want to make it into a shoes. So what's the law then? The law is you have to do an action in the tabletop to show. You have to start putting your screw gun in, start cutting. You have to start putting a knife in, start cutting the leather. Once you start putting the knife in to start cutting the leather of that tabletop, now you're showing me you're doing an action that no longer it's going to be used as a tabletop. You're going to make it take it to the next level of using it for shoes. Right. But the tabletop being a utensil, something, let's say like a utensil, this food is susceptible to contamination, and utensils are susceptible to contamination. So maybe it's like the fact that it's used as a table. It's considered. Let's say you put it on. Let's say it's something that we consider it a utensil. It's some sort of, however it's used. Maybe it can even be something that's movable that you put on top of the table, like a tray. Like you have a tray, you put a tray. So tray is considered a utensil. So it's considered, let's say it's considered like a tray to hold things on it. Yeah, it's a table. Therefore, let's say that we'll call it a utensil. So that's what. So we need to, it's also Abiderech HaMusar, to become tameh. You just need machshav to be susceptible to contamination, having the wrong mindset. But to remove yourself, you have to do an action. Not enough just to say I'm not going to do the bad thing anymore. You gotta do action to strengthen yourself, not to do the bad things anymore. But that's what the Gemara says. The ain olam min tuma. The ain olam mitumatan ela b'shiri ma'isa. It only leaves the status of contamination with a change of action. You got to do an action, like we said. You have to start putting the knife back into the table and start cutting the table. Start cutting the tabletop because I want to make it into shoes. Maisa motzi. Now the Mishnah gives the general rules regarding tumah. Maisa motzi miyad maisa or miyad mashava. If you did an action that makes the utensil back into the processing manufacturing stage, like we said, you started cutting the tabletop, that removes the previous status of the utensil. Whether the utensil was completed, whether there was a maisa, whether there was an action that you had done earlier, you had done something to complete something, or you had a mind. You originally had a certain mindset. The action removes it. So he says like this: if, let's say, you go ahead and you cut the leather in a way, to beautify the table. You did an action. You see, by the tabletop, there's two ways you make a tabletop. You can make a plain tabletop, right? It's a piece of leather, and you didn't do anything unique in this leather that that shows that it's for a tabletop. But as is, it's useful as a tabletop. So in order for you to change that, even though you just had a mind, I want to use it as a tabletop, that's I have to do an action to remove. Good morning, Boker Tov. I have to do an action to remove it from that status of a tabletop. But now, not only that, good morning. The action also, even if I made the tabletop in a way that I showed you that I'm using it for a tabletop. Not only was the leather ready for a tabletop, I made a design, like a tabletop design, specifically that people make for a tabletop. But my subsequent action will remove it from that tabletop, whether the tabletop was just ordinarily made plain tabletop, without any special unique action to show that it's made for a tabletop, or even if I made a specific action to show that it's made for a tabletop, I can remove that status by doing an action. We are now learning Yud Daled Amud Aleph 14a, and we're talking about the Inyanei Tumah, about a utensil that became contaminated. It became, in order for a utensil to become susceptible to contamination, it has to be a finished product, right? Morning. But if it's not a finished product, right, it's not susceptible to contamination. So the Gemara says, if once you have mindset, if you had a mindset to use it in a certain fashion that it's already considered finished, even though you could technically go to other levels to make this item into a different item. But once you had a mind that, let's say you want this to be a tabletop, and you could have gone further with the leather. You could have made the leather into shoes, but you wanted it for a tabletop. So once it reached the level that it could be used for a tabletop, it already is susceptible to contamination. And to remove it from that level, once it was a tabletop and you originally had a mind a tabletop, you see how much your mindset makes a difference. If you're cutting the leather, you're fashioning the leather, depending on what you had in mind, is at which point it will be susceptible to receive contamination. If you had in mind you want to be a tabletop, once it reached the level that it could be used as a tabletop, it's susceptible to contamination. But if you had in mind that you wanted it not to be a tabletop, you wanted it to be sandals, so even if the leather reached the level that it could be a tabletop, it's not yet susceptible to contamination because you were not yet finished with the process because you were intending to go further. Is that clear? Is that clear in the? Okay, so you'll pick it up. So now the Gemara says. So that's what the Gemara says. 2 lines from the top. We are on Yud Daled Amud Aleph. So Maaseh motzi miyad maaseh or miyad machshava. An action has the ability to change the status of that item, that it's no longer the previous item that it was, and it would lose its status of susceptible to contamination once you did an action in it to show that I'm still working the item and it's not finished yet. But machshava eina motzia lo miyad maaseh v'lo miyad machshava. If I just have a change of heart, I made a tabletop, and I made a tabletop in a way with an action in the tabletop. I made something beautiful around it, a design that's made for a tabletop. And now I changed my mind. I say, you know what? I don't want it anymore to be used as a tabletop. I have in mind I want to make it into sandals. I want to go further, cut the leather open, and go take it to go to another level in the manufacturing process. My change of thought is not enough to say it's no longer susceptible to contamination because it's not a finished product. You already have a finished product. You had a mind that it was already a finished product. Now you want to change it just with your mind? That's not enough. Your mind cannot change a finished product. Certainly a finished product that you did in a clear action in the product that shows you that you had in mind that it should be a tabletop. Even if you did not do an action in the item originally, you just had in mind that I want to be for a tabletop. The fact that I had that mindset and I finished it as a tabletop, it's susceptible to contamination. Now I change my mind. I say, I don't want it anymore for a tabletop. That doesn't change. I have to do an action. I have to go ahead and what? Put the knife into the tabletop. Then I'm showing that that's like breaking it. That's like showing that it's not finished yet. So the Gemara says, if just changing thought will not remove, I have to do an action to remove it from its previous state. So the Gemara's question is the same thing. If you had in mind that you wanted to use this grain, you cut it for the purpose of food, and now you're saying, and now you go ahead and you want to use it for schach. You didn't do any action you didn't change. What do you say? Right, it's still the same food. It's still, I made it for eating purposes. I have the store. If you would cut out the thing, if you do an action, but here you just put it on stop, you didn't change it. So how could the rabbi say that it's no longer susceptible to contamination? You have to cut the stalk, do something in the stalk. But if you didn't do anything in the stalk, how could there be an opinion that says that it's no longer susceptible to contamination by merely, what'd you say? Right, but they're both lack of action and thought. Right, you have to do an action. Right, you have to do both. Right, you have to do action. You have to do action. Right. Right. So the Gemara says, so how could there be an opinion that says that it's no longer susceptible to contamination by the case when you cut it originally for food, where the stalk had a status that is susceptible to contamination, and now you're saying it's no longer susceptible because you had in mind something else. Use it for something else. By having a mind shouldn't be enough. So the Gemara says, the chashivi. Maybe a thought is not enough to change a utensil. A utensil is something which is very important. We find that there's certain halachot that a utensil is more important than food in certain aspects. It's a higher level in certain ways. So therefore, maybe a utensil. It's a utensil. It's a utensil. Once it became a utensil, to change the status of you from being a handle. Once you had in mind that it should be a utensil, that it should be a tabletop, so now you want to go in and change that status of the utensil. Maybe you need more to change the status of utensil than to just change the status of a handle on a food. Maybe for a handle on a food, as long as you change your mindset, you don't want it to be a handle of food anymore, okay, it's not a handle of food anymore. But when it comes to utensil, maybe you need more by utensil. And we found this concept of importance of a utensil regarding other halachot over food. That means certain things you need more, you need to do more by utensil. What do you say? It's more chashuv, it's more in certain aspects. So that's right. You're right, because there's certain things. Let's say to make a utensil tameh, right? There's certain things you need more to be done. Certain aspects you need a higher level to make a food contaminated. You don't need, food is light. You don't need so much to make it contaminated. To make a person tameh, but to make a utensil tameh, you need something stronger to make it tameh. So we see it's a stronger item. It's more chashuv. It's a stronger item than food. So therefore, the Gemara says maybe when it comes to utensil, we treat it differently than we treat it with food. And to change the status of utensil, you need an action. To change the status of a food from handle of the food to being not handled, maybe thought is enough. That's what the Gemara suggests. To that, the Gemara says, but to be a handle on food, it's only for the purpose of food. B'machshava nachta, machshava salka. Maybe with the thought it came a handle, and with a thought it removes its status from a handle. But the Gemara says it's not true. But now we learned in the Mishnah, you call your dota ochlin. Any handle on food, let's say the stalk, the straw part of the grain, any handle of food, shebatzison begoren, that you were batzison begoren. The Gemara is going to explain in a minute what does batzison mean. You did something. Either it means you untied the bundle, or it means you actually, the animal actually beat down and threshed and knocked out crushed the straw, the stalk. There's two possibilities of what does it mean. Any handle that either one opinion is you untied the stalk, or you went ahead and you crushed it, tahoro. Once you did that in the handle, you went ahead, then it will go ahead. It's not mekabel tumah. Meaning what you're showing here, is that you're not interested anymore. You did something in the grain that you're showing that you're not interested anymore, that for the stalk to be connected to the grain. Either you crushed it, you started beating down on the grain, so that shows that on the stalk, that shows you're not interested in it being attached to the kernels. That's why you're beating it, you're crushing it, or you untie the bundle. As long as when you have a bundle of the straw of the grain tied together, you're showing that you want it together. That's why you tie it together. Once you untie the bundle and you don't mind that it becomes scattered around, it shows you're not so interested in the handle. So, right, if you cut the stalk of the grain and you put the grain is mekabel tumah, the grain is not kosher stock, but the stalk, once you cut it off, would be kosher. Would be. The grain is subject to contamination, but the stalk is not. It has no purpose. You want to put up the stalk. You want to put up the. You say. Right, because when they were together, you would have put it together, right? So therefore, when you separate it, then you just put up the stalk, right? So the Gemara said, and now Bishlam Lamandiyama Batsasan Hitra Gudan. If the one that says that Batsa means you just untied it, you untied the bundle, so that by the fact that you untied the bundle, that shows you're not looking that it should be held together. And therefore, shapir, then everything is good. I mean, according to that opinion, untying the bundle, you didn't really do anything in the stalks itself. You just untied the bundle. But you're showing you don't mind, you're not so interested, it has to stay together. By untying it, now it's going to scatter around, it's going to move around. You're showing you're not so interested in the handle. So if you say that just untying it, showing not interested in the handle is enough, so we could say that when it comes to food, just merely showing you don't want the handle is sufficient. But according to the opinion that says it's not enough to just untie the bundle of ears of grain, you have to actually crush it. You have to do an action in the ears of grain. What are we going to say? We see that we require the same level to remove it as we do by a utensil, by doing an action. You require the same level when it comes to a food. In order to make it that it's no longer considered a handle of the food, you have to do something in the food, in the handle itself. Well, you crushed the stalk. You crushed it. That's the handle. No, but not because the grain, not because the grain. You're gonna. I'm saying you might not always have to do that. I'm saying in this particular case, he went ahead and once you did an action in the stalk, you beat it, you beat the stalk. That shows you're not so interested in the stalk being connected to the what, to the grain. And at that point, it loses the status of connection to the grain. It's no longer considered a handle, and therefore that part is no longer susceptible to contamination. If a dead animal touches that part, it will not bring contamination to the rest to the food part. If it's not touching the food part, because it's not considered connected. We don't look at it as a handle. The grain could, but since, even though you didn't remove it, but since you showed that you don't want this handle, you're not interested that the stalk should be a handle for the grain, for the food part. So therefore, we look at them as two separate entities. And if the stalk gets touched by a dead sheret, it's not going to bring contamination to the food part. When they're considered a handle, so even if the stalk, if let's say the grain is here, it's on this part of is over here, and this part is just the stalk. If the stalk gets contaminated, it will get touched by the dead animal. The whole thing will become contaminated if it's a handle. If it's because they're connected to each other, it's like one entity. But if it's not a handle, then the fact that this becomes touched, nothing happens. This does not receive contamination if it's not a handle, and therefore it does not bring contamination to the other part. So the Gemara says, Hachinami, the Gemara says, but some mamash. You know what the case that we were talking about in our case in our in the Breita that we brought earlier? That he originally had a mind for food, and then he crushed it. That's why there's an opinion that says, good morning, the opinion that says that once you crushed it, it loses the status of a handle. So that was the explanation of that Tana in the Breita that we had on the previous page, because you actually crushed it. That's why it loses the status of a handle. So the Gemara says, if you're going to tell me that the reason why that rabbi says it loses the status of a handle because you crushed it, so what's the opinion? Why is there an opposing rabbi? We said in the Breita that we brought earlier, there's two early opinions, whether the way the Gemara Menashe explained the Breita, when the Breita says they're arguing whether the grain, is it a handle or not? It's talking about a case, you originally cut it for what? For food. Then you changed your mind and you want to use it for schach. And now there's a difference of opinion whether it's still considered a handle when you had to change your mind to using the schach. And the Gemara says, how could there be a morning Ariel? The Gemara says, what do you mean? Just having a change of mind is not enough. That how can anybody say it loses the status of a handle? So the Gemara says you did an action. If you did an action, how could there be an opposing opinion that says that it's still a handle? If you did an action, the animal stepped on the stalk, so you're showing you don't want the stalk to be what? So why isn't your action showing enough? Your action, why isn't enough that the animal stepped on it? Why shouldn't that be enough? How could there be an opinion that say it's still a handle if you're showing you don't want it to be a handle anymore? Through an action. The Gemara says the other opinion holds this action is not enough. Why? Because you still might want it to be a handle. Why? Because maybe the crushing just softens the stalk. But you still it makes it easy for you to handle the fact that the grain is still attached to the stalk, still makes it easy for you to what? To move it around. So therefore there's a purpose in it being what? Connected, and therefore that opinion holds it still has the status of a what? Of a handle. So that's what the Gemara says. My time with the Gemara says the Amak Rabbi Yossi. Hold up, Rabbi Yossi. Nan, Rabbi Yossi mitame. Rabbi Yossi says that even though you were but the son, even though according to this opinion you did an action in the grain, you crushed the stalk part. You crushed the stalk part of the grain, it's still susceptible to contamination as a handle. So the Gemara says, Hi, how could you compare the two? the fact that Rabbi Yossi says over there it's still a handle, Bishlam Hatam time Rabbi Yossi the Chazia, because it has purpose at that point, that when you crush it, it's still serving as a handle. Because the Rav Shimon Lakish says that you could use a pitchfork. You know, if when you have it, when you're moving the grain around and you have a pitchfork and you want to get a hold of the grain, so you stick the pitchfork as like it has like teeth. There's like 3 teeth in the front. You stick the pitchfork into the grain, and now into the straw, which is attached to the what? To the grain, the stalk with the grain. And now it's easy for you to go ahead and move it, and then you can move the grain by you have something it can hold. You have something to meet that the pitchfork can hold into by sticking it into the stalk that's attached to the grain. And then you can go ahead and you stick it in, and then you pick it up, and then you pull out and then you drop you can move it, and you get rid of it. So it has a purpose. But what's the purpose over here when you crush? In the case we had the stalks of the fig stalks, the grape stalks. There's no pitchfork. It's not a granary. So how could you compare the case of the granary? Rabbi Yossi says when you did an action, it still has the status of contamination, is because you're going to use it as a handle, because you want to put the pitchfork into it. And by the way, I think the commentators explain, only because it originally was cut for food and it got the status of contamination, and now you want to remove it from the status, it's not enough if it still has a use for a pitchfork. If it would just be for a pitchfork, that might not have been enough. But originally, now that you want to use it as a pitchfork, so it has use. But then point A to point B, so it has use. So therefore, the store. No, again, if you want to hold the grain, the grain will fall through the teeth of the pitchfork. No, but it's showing that you're happy. The point is, if we could say it might not be enough. This type of action, therefore Rabbi Yossi said, then that's the argument. That's the argument. One rabbi said it is enough. The other one says that's not enough. One rabbi said it's enough that you go ahead and you beat it, and that's enough. It's no longer here. The other one said you're still benefiting as use, as being connected. So therefore, it should still have a status of a handle. Of the tumah, the contamination. Because at the end of the day, we have to identify it. Is it a handle? Because we're saying a handle has the status of the item that it's holding on to. So if it's a handle, then it should retain its contamination. So the Gemara says, what did you say? So we'll see tomorrow. We'll finish up the Gemara. We're almost at the Mishnah. I want to wish everyone a beautiful, beautiful day. We should have the Beit HaMikdash back, and then we'll be worried about all these tumah and things. But this is practical today. If you throw it up on a sukkah for Succah, in ears of grain that has food contained inside of it, what would be the status of that? Okay. Have a great day, everybody.